Thank you everyone for hosting me here today. It's a real pleasure. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people and elders past and present on whose land we're meeting. So yes, so thanks for that introduction, and yeah, I hope that we'll have the opportunity to really have a look at some of the what the data and information is kind of saying about sort of emerging labour market. It's one of the characteristics these days. When I started working in data and information, the problem was always that there's not enough data, and you have to go and get it, and you have to chase it, you have to buy it, you have to go. Now there's almost the kind of the opposite problem. There is so much data that it's really hard to make sense of what's important and what's the white noise and what's the stuff that's really cutting through. So it's not a comprehensive overview of every bit of data. I'm trying to sort of give you the key highlights, but there'll be opportunities, I think, to sort of talk about and explore later on. But we're also here in the context of future planning. I apologise, the screen's a little bit small. Some of you up the back might struggle to read some of this stuff. There are some places up in the front row if you really are struggling. But really,
we will have the presentation available.
Yeah, the presentation will be available, sure. So if we're really looking at future planning, so I guess a little bit maybe about sort of foresight lane and who we are, and sort of the area that we work in is around strategic foresight, which is really around this idea of future planning, which is partly what you're doing today. It's around creating the environments through which the possible futures can be created. So it's about understanding what's possible in the future, reading the signals from the past and the signals from the present to understand around what could be possible and to start trying to create those futures, rather than this idea of inheriting a future based on sort of assumptions about what the present and happened in the present and the past. So in some way, this is a bit of an opportunity to kind of to stop and test some of those assumptions, I suppose. And it's really a way of sensing and responding to what's happening, rather than predicting and controlling what is going to happen. And just a sort of example that I sometimes use around this is like, this is a picture of London in the 1890s. And at that time, the London City Council, Greater London Borough, whatever they were called then, did projections into the future. And they did a projection to the year 1980, and they projected that by around 1980, London would have a horse population of 7 million. And so they started buying land and clearing land for stables, because that was going to be the major need into the future. Obviously, a few things changed since then, and some of that stable land is maybe being used for other purposes now. But I guess it's just a little reminder of the folly sometimes, I suppose, of looking too far ahead, and this idea of trying to predict and control what the future is going to look like, rather than sensing and responding. And if they had have been looking at some of the emerging technologies at the time, they might have been more attuned to the idea of the emergence of motor cars. So I guess a bit about how we're going to work today, both in this session and I'm sure later on into the day. We're working on the assumption and knowledge that there's wisdom in the room, and that's you guys. That's where the wisdom and knowledge about systems so often comes from experience. So we really want you to bring that wisdom. We want to, like as I was kind of saying before, using the time and space to see things new, looking for the creative and sort of real ideas. Yeah, less is often more, and that's kind of what I was saying before about the availability of data. Sometimes the more data we have, the more data we present, but we're trying to look for those kind of compelling and clear stories rather than overwhelming with data. I hope I've got the balance right. You'll let me know. And yeah, this idea around plans, like I kind of said before, they're outlining sort of the desired possibilities, not prescribing the absolute futures. And they're for stepping into. So I would really encourage you when you're planning to be coming up with things that you can start acting on and moving, and that you can start to really start living out. And I guess just these pictures here, we've got sort of sometimes the planning process and how we're going to work a bit today. Sometimes it's a train track, getting from A to B in the shortest, most efficient time as possible. And other times it's this picture of the guy there with the thoughts kind of going that it is the chance to think differently. So really what I'll be covering in this kind of first half an hour or so, just a bit about change and the kind of changes that we're seeing at the moment that probably good to be aware of. Some framework, a framework really for looking at and understanding change that I hope would be useful. And then we're going to get into a bit more of the nitty-gritty stuff around the sort of labour and industry profile in G21. Feel free to ask questions, but I'm sure we'll have time at the end. And as I said, you'll get copies of this. So change, if we're talking about change, I guess it's a statement of the obvious to say that change happens, as I've got up there. I guess this is a picture of, this came from some work that we did, Forsyth Lane, when we were doing some strategic planning with disability organisations in the southwest of Victoria, around Warrnambool. And sort of the metaphor or kind of the deep story that they kind of came up with for themselves when we were talking about change is that they were the 12 apostles. And that they were sort of, they imagined themselves, this network of disability organisations kind of standing rigid in the ocean, knowing that the waves were coming in and pounding against them, but they couldn't do anything about it. And they were just looking around, waiting for the next one to fall over. And that was kind of, they realised that was their sort of deep identity, that they knew the change was coming, but they were doing nothing about it. And they kind of then moved into some different kind of ideas or metaphors for themselves as to how they could operate. And we then started talking about the being part of a jungle where there are different kind of, where there are tall trees and small shrubs and room for all sorts of different, who are nourishing each other as part of a network. So anyway, just kind of to keep that idea of just try to avoid being like the 12 apostles and to be sort of able to move there. Disruptive change is kind of a term that's thrown around a lot, and I don't want to sort of add to the sort of, like I say, the white noise around some of this stuff. But I think we saw with the example with the planning for horse population growth in London before, this idea of disruptive change, I suppose, is that the kind of change that that you're not in control of, and that actually change the rules by which you operate. And I've just kind of got a few examples here. I'm not going to go into great depth, but I think you can recognise a lot of the stuff that's happening here. Kodak, was the dominant player in its in the photographic market because it controlled the technology, and I think in many cases invented the technology around printing and the efficient printing and distribution of photographs. Digital technology came in. They thought, no, we're the leaders in this. We've been around for 100 years. We'll be around for 100 more, and they've gone out of business because they didn't pick up on this new way of distributing and reproducing photography that I'm sure younger generations today would look back on the dark old days when we actually had to print out our photographs. A few others, that Blockbuster Video, that you still see a few of them around, but they're closing because they had an incredibly inefficient model where you had to actually come in and pick a video, bring it home, bring it back, and then they would fine you if you brought it back. Now, if you brought it back late, now with the rise of the streaming services like Netflix and so on, their business model suddenly just looks implausible. Taxis with Uber, like I said, I'm not going to go into this in a great deal, but I think you can see some of the examples of how change can happen to you, and you've got to be kind of trying to move with those changes and anticipate those changes as much as possible. So ageing populations, and so it's not here. We are baby boomers, hear us roar, but it's not just. In this instance, it's not just we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about the health and social sector, with an ageing population, that there'll be a rise in kind of chronic disease and health needs. But I guess what is also happening is that baby boomers are sort of the generation who grew up in the 1960s and 70s, who will have completely different expectations around what services are. And so if we're looking at sort of facilities and services for older people into the future, not the not distant future, they're going to look very different from what they did before because of the expectations. So it's not always technology that drives these changes. Obviously climate change I've kind of got here as well. So there is a big shift happening. And I'm just really summarising this quite quickly, but into three sort of main categories, I suppose. But this idea that government, that there is a gap between what it once did and what people have grown up with expectations of what government can do and what it can now do. We'll talk about that in a moment. But connectedness and diversity, that this idea that, collaboration is actually going to be one of the key sort of value that you can add within a new and emerging economy. And this picture here is of the thousands of small fish actually ganging up on the big shark. I think that's a kind of a new image that is kind of becoming plausible, because a lot of it is driven by citizens that are now more active and equipped and actually have access to technology in ways that didn't before. I'll talk about that in a moment too. So just a few kind of currents of change. I hope you can read some of this, but I'm sure you can see that picture. So this changing role of government and this idea, this catchphrase that kind of took off over the past few years, the age of entitlement is over, and Joe Hockey became the poster boy for it. And he was really talking about that idea about the gap, I suppose I was kind of talking about before, that there is a difference between what we once expected and what government is now able to do, in sort of in an environment where, there's an expectation of, governments being able to deliver budget surplus and so on. Now, we can argue about the politics of that, but I think it's a strong theme that came through. Didn't quite work out for Joe, I suppose, because some of the behaviours and sort of the ways in which it played out didn't quite sort of match the rhetoric, so that's sort of a caricature of that sort of, when behaviour isn't quite matching. So I guess what I mean is, it's become a bit of a slogan, and it's been used on multiple sides of politics, but there is something quite real to it. So I guess a few sort of maybe more down-to-earth examples here. So these are kind of, I guess, three people that I've kind of noticed in the last little while who are really talking about this. This is Peter Shergold, who delivered this report for the Victorian government called Service Sector Reform. Good understanding, it's kind of in mothballs at the moment, but anyway, I think there were some quite interesting ideas in there that are pointing towards this shift. Whether that report gets implemented or not, there are some really interesting ideas. And this idea that public service is moving from service delivery to system stewardship is kind of a shift that's been happening for some time. So I guess what that's saying is that into the future, we perhaps can't be expecting the government and the public service to be as much in the direct service delivery. Obviously there are some exceptions, but it will be more about that sort of strategic connecting of people, individuals, communities and organisations within communities. This is Pradeep Phillip. He used to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, but he's now the CEO of LaunchVic, which is a kind of an entrepreneurial sort of body, government body, but that is really around a new organisation to help seed and get new businesses up and running. He has a very kind of strong social focus, and really recommend that you look at some of his. There's a speech that he gave a little while ago that I can send you the link to. That's really really gives you a sense of how some of this new entrepreneurial kind of approaches can start to apply into social sector. But really what he's saying here is that one thing that governments can do is give confidence, and I know that that's a big issue in this sector. Stability and kind of confidence and the ability to do future planning. But I think that the way that you're coming together like this and in other ways really starts to, and with supported by government, really starts to show the kind of the ways in which the future can roll out. And this is Bessie Graham, who's the CEO of an organisation called the Difference Incubator in Melbourne. And they're really about trying to connect investors, so actual investors who are expecting a financial return but also expecting a social return with social organisations. She really talks a lot about that we need to stop thinking about ourselves as the not-for-profit industry or not-for-profit sector and think about the for-purpose sector. And I'm not kind of going into that in great depth, but just kind of showing you some of the signals here. So there are actually people, and what she has spoken about and her organisation has spoken about is that there are actually a lot of people looking to invest in social outcomes, but there aren't a lot of projects that are actually coming through that pipeline for people to invest in. So again, just some of the signals. Technological advancement and kind of changing things quickly. And this is perhaps a modern characteristic, is that some of the changes that we talk about happen more rapidly now than they might have in the past. But yeah, this is the unimaginable becoming possible through technology. This is a 3D printed home in, I think it's in Holland, and fully operational. It's printed without labour. It's constructed without using manual labour. I think it takes 48 hours to actually, I'm not sure if you've ever seen a 3D printer, but this is like a giant version where it just squirts layer upon layer of material, and that comes out at the end of it. If you think about the implications for that and things like the construction industry, then that's huge. Obviously, we're not there yet. This is I've forgotten the name of it, but it's a cathedral in Barcelona that hasn't been able to be built for the last, has remained unfinished for the past 150 years or more, and now through 3D printing it's actually been sort of completed. Information is everywhere. We've got this kind of rise of smart cities and so on, where the city and your environment starts to respond to the actions and activities that you do. I won't go into that too much, but we've also got technology in the hands of citizens. So we can see here, it's an extreme example, but this is kind of the Arab Spring in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, where it was these social networking tools that were once used or are currently used, but mainly for sort of social and friendship interaction, actually became sort of political tools. And so you can just see how things are kind of shifting quickly. So it's kind of been characterised as a fourth industrial revolution, where the pace of change is actually happening more rapidly than ever before. Not that it hasn't changed before. That fourth industrial revolution is kind of the idea of this organisation called the World Economic Forum. And so this is, I guess, another sort of current. I'm sure you can't actually really read that, but this is actually saying these are the 21st century skills that are kind of required to kind of navigate those kind of worlds that we've just described. So it's talking about foundational literacies, applying core skills to everyday tasks, competencies, so approaching complex challenges, and character qualities, how students are engaging with their changing environment. You can have a look at this later, to kind of see what those actual skills are. But I think foundational competency, character less so, but I think is very much in the sort of the strengths that your organisations have. So I think in some ways you're actually really well positioned to be preparing for this. This is a framework that we think about that we use for thinking about change, and I hope that it will be useful for you, later today and in the future. But I'll try and go through it as quickly as possible. But there are three. I guess these are sort of simultaneous kind of ways of looking at the world, I suppose, or things that are happening in the world that are happening at once. You've got Horizon 1, H1, which is this idea of business as usual, which are the familiar kind of patterns and flows of resources and so on, and the ways of doing things that we're familiar that we do every day. That Horizon 1, that idea of the everyday way of doing things, has obviously changed over time. The history is kind of a strong informer into how these things, but that's where we see ourselves, and sometimes we can't see beyond that. Others are kind of sitting out here and looking out here at Horizon 3, which is these kind of competing visions of the future, as we call it. But it's really the out there kind of stuff that we can't even sort of, that we can only imagine at the moment, but can't quite see how it's coming. Now, these are obviously very different perspectives, but in between you've got this kind of second horizon, what we call Horizon 2, where you've got Horizon 2 negative, and it's where change is kind of happening to you, where there's incremental change that you are having to adapt to, and that's maybe more, something like the what was I saying? The 12 apostles kind of with the change kind of sort of battering them, and they're kind of having to adapt and sort of read the wind and understand. Or there's out here, Horizon 2 positive, the transformative change, where you can actually start to preempt, anticipate and get ahead of the change. I think that's probably, you know, a really positive space to kind of try and occupy. But all of these perspectives are valid. So I guess this is an example of the kind of stuff in your world, education and in sort of labour market, the kind of things that would attach themselves to these different horizons. So in Horizon 1, it's probably where you're looking at classrooms and curriculum, A-frames and so on, and you know, being physically located together in a classroom. And on the sort of career or sort of industry side, it's kind of this idea of a vocational career and a pathway. Like I say, no one's critical of Horizon 1. It's incredibly powerful and it's where we exist, and it's actually where we've got to grapple with most of all. And this is the scenario that you often find yourself in. But as we move into kind of the sort of Horizon 2, we move into maybe more of online delivery, not being bounded to classrooms, but sometimes just replicating sort of a classroom-based style into online doesn't always work so well. And that's why it's maybe been captured by some of the H1 kind of perspectives. And also the casualisation of the workforce is where, you know, moving from vocational career, job for life kind of idea into the casualisation is where some of these changes are starting to happen, but we haven't really got beyond into what the next thing is. Then into that kind of transformative change kind of space, we might start looking at peer-to-peer learning, where people are actually kind of doing skills exchange and technology enabling the connections that occur in a place like this to sort of happen more effectively. And this, in the career, like this idea of a gig economy, I've heard it sort of described as, which is where you never actually consider yourself as part of a particular career, but you're picking up jobs all over the place. And then in this kind of Horizon 3, we're kind of maybe talking about virtual reality sort of delivery and sort of automation and robotic kind of stuff. Now, we're not going to talk about that kind of stuff, but just to kind of give you a frame, like this, all of this stuff is actually happening now. You've got to, I suppose, try and understand whereabouts in it that you're kind of now and where you might want to be moving to. These are just examples, and it's just a framework for looking at change. Sorry, I've been talking pretty rapidly, not giving many people a chance to talk, so I'll just stop for a moment.
Can I ask a question? Just
Yeah.
in relation to the sort of H1 to H3.
Yeah.
It's sort of a bit like your analogy of England many years ago, the transition of time. So if I think about a neighbourhood centre and that transition into virtual reality learning, and the technology around that, is that technology continues to challenge us in terms of the information we get. Things seem to be speeding up in terms of change, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know that. And so for that sort of framework and where we sit, what's your comments around the timing and all of it?
I think, I mean, like I was saying, this is all actually happening at once. And what I was sort of referring to before, I guess that fourth industrial revolution kind of idea of all these changes, is that actually these changes, probably what we're going to be saying is that the length of time between this becoming Horizon 1, or the, you know, the new business as usual, and that is going to shorten. You know, so I think that's where it's important that you're kind of, you could say, forget about this stuff. Let's focus on what we're doing. But I think we're almost, I'm not sure about uniquely positioned, but there is something about now that means we've probably got to be looking at all of this at once. But I guess what I just sort of reiterate, we're not saying that it's a positive and kind of inevitable, you go through this stage, then you go through this stage, then you go through this, and you end up here. They're actually all happening at once. So it might be that business as usual is the absolute best place for you to occupy, because that's where your market is, and that's where your influence is, and that's where your niche is. It's not a negative way to be. I guess just really quickly, you know, that there are negative ways of looking at this, you know, where people in Horizon 1 are looking to Horizon 2 and saying that they're too risky. Horizon 2 think that those in Horizon 1 are being obstructive. There's compromising happening from Horizon 3 to Horizon 2, and impracticality happening from, that they're just not getting it. But there are actually positive perspectives, and in as a bigger group as possible, you will get positive ways of looking at this. So those in Horizon 1 who are in that business as usual can look to those who are probably more inclined towards that second horizon for ideas, and those in the Horizon 2 are looking for support from those who are really entrenched in that established way of doing things. That Horizon 2 can look to those out, in the robotic world as for kind of an inspiration, and the Horizon 3 can look back to those who are to be an ally. So I think I guess what I just emphasise, I suppose, that these are not sort of either or. You need to get out of Horizon 1. I think we really want to validate that.
Just as you're going through that, it helps me to think about, what I said in the opening statements around that tension between us as community development organisations and the lifelong learning stuff, and about how we work within that tension. And this, to me, gives a really good way of thinking about that, because we know that one of the things that we do well is that interaction with people, the social stuff. Yeah. And so how do we hold on to the good bits of that, but don't get captured and only do that? Yes. So it actually gives a good way, I think, for
well, I hope so, and please feel free, I hope that you can use it later on when you're doing some of your planning. Because in many ways, it would be kind of illogical to abandon this stuff, because that's the world you operate in, and that's the way. But you've got to be kind of driving towards it, because soon that will go the way of the horses in London.
David, would it also be fair to say that there's a whole lot of theories of change,
yeah,
and other ones around transitioning and leadership, and really around dispersed leadership? Because I look at the size of this network, and there are people who are in different levels. If you looked at it and tried to categorise that model, but it's really the trying and trialling and having a go at certain things that are across the horizons that enable that change to happen in some ways.
I think you said dispersed leadership or generative leadership is kind of a good way of looking at that. Leadership can come from any level of and I think that's where I know not all of you can read this, but I think that's where this is probably a really useful framework as well, to kind of think that instead of looking at we need to leave things behind, we need to sort of embrace all of them at once. So that's kind of a framework for change, and hopefully a useful one. We're going to look now at the region. I think I'm looking all right for time. Yeah. So now we're going to look at this region, G21. Like I said before, there is a lot of information available. I'm sure a lot of you have come across it before, and the G21 organisation does a fantastic job in kind of collating and presenting that. So I hope that I'm adding, a good bit of value to that by what I'm going to present to you. But I have included, a list of good resources for you to keep looking at. There's certainly a lot of information there. So what do we know about this region? It's changing rapidly. What was the figure I saw? It's going to be a population of 320,000 in the next 20 years or so, which I can't remember what the percentage increase that is, but I think you can see that actually puts this region as a major region, certainly in the Australian context, but even worldwide, you don't get cities in the hinterlands kind of that size. Well, there are plenty of them, but this will certainly be one of them, and the change that kind of comes from that. So there's fundamental shifts in the sort of the demographics and identity that come with that. I mean, a lot of that is kind of related to this kind of idea that unemployment is kind of consistently high here. Well, consistently is maybe not the right word, but it does fluctuate. You can see sort of this is the fluctuating unemployment rate. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. I've kind of lifted it straight from Enterprise Geelong. So thank you for that, Enterprise Geelong. But The green line is the Geelong SA4, which we'll kind of talk about a bit. Let's just call it the Geelong region. We'll talk about what that includes in a moment. And you can see it's kind of yo-yoing up and down, but there are, you know, extreme highs and sort of, I wouldn't call them extreme lows, but it's kind of up and down there. Similar with youth unemployment rate. Less so, it's kind of more on the higher than the Victorian and state average than the general unemployment rate, and it does get incredibly high, up around 22%. But I guess when we're kind of talking about the sort of the new demographics and the new identity, I might be wrong here, but I'm just kind of, it's a generally normal kind of socioeconomic profile, and I do it in heavy quotation marks because we know there's no such thing as normal, but that there are those kind of pockets, and there is that kind of seeming sort of volatility at the moment. Happy to be sort of challenged on that, but often think about Geelong in this region as kind of extremely normal, as in normal in extreme ways. It's kind of contradictory. Through that, it's and attracting, and has attracted a lot of government attention and a lot of, well, I don't know, a lot, but you know, you'll have a better sense than me probably of the level of investment and attention that's kind of come in.
Isn't that more about the fact that we're
marginal seats?
Yep. Not anything to do with our economic profile. It's all about that we're marginal seats.
Possibly. I mean,
Yep.
I mean, perhaps the ways in which that attention manifests.
I think it's just that we're marginal seats.
Yeah, well, that's possible. Again, that's a Horizon 1 sort of, you know, reality that we kind of work with. But so I kind of show, and this kind of idea of the pockets of socioeconomic disadvantage. This is the map of the socioeconomic indicators for areas, CEFA as it's known, from the last census, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I'm not going to sit here and talk to you about the disadvantage that I'm sure you are well familiar with in your local communities, but you can see that there is the darker the red, the more relatively socioeconomically disadvantaged, and you can see these kind of pockets in the northern parts of Geelong, in the sort of the south and east parts of Geelong, and in Colac and other areas. Again, I'm not going to kind of go through those factors in great detail because I'm sure you have quite a good understanding of that, but it does kind of show. Like I say, this kind of extreme sort of characteristics that occur in this area. So industry profile. So the year 2020. So I'm not going to make the same mistake as the London planners. I'm only going to go sort of a modest distance into the future. And I'm just going to show you what some people think that the industry is going to look like then. So keep in mind while we're doing this one of these people equals 100 people. And you'll get the idea in a moment. Right. So that's the year 2020, and that's the number of people who have jobs in the Geelong region. When we say the Geelong region, I'll just kind of step back for a moment. That's the Geelong, it's a geographical statistical term called the SA4, Statistical Area 4. And it includes pretty much the G21, but it doesn't include Colac Otway. So those of you from Colac Otway, I apologise that you're not necessarily in this picture, but I have given you some extra attention later on to make up for it. But I think there are differences. But anyway, in the year 2020, so we've got 130,000 jobs, roughly. I've rounded up because it sometimes gets confusing to talk about, you know, particularly to talk about precise numbers, particularly when we're talking about the future. I hope you can see, but yeah, you won't be able to read that. But I'm just kind of building up the picture, I suppose, of what the industry might look like at that time. So this here, 2,700 people in arts and recreation services. God, I can't even read. That's how small it is. And we've got a similar number, a little bit less, in information, media and telecommunications. So I'm just going to start sort of building this up a bit, and we might start maybe making your predictions of what's going to come next as it sort of gets to the business end. 4,000 in agriculture, forestry and fishing, which is 4% of the total. And It's not quite projected to decline. I've got some figures like not quite projected to decline, but it's going to stay pretty steady.
So this isn't growth, this is what the jobs...
This is the actual, yeah, this is not growth. We'll talk about that in a moment. 5,000 in transport, postal and warehouse. Similar amount. Now, yeah. Oop. 7,500 in professional, scientific and technical services, and 11,000 in public administration, which is a lot of the government kind of roles, local, state, and increasingly around here, Commonwealth. So there is a bit of growth. There is a bit of growth going on there, but not massively. Okay, now we're getting into some bigger ones. I hope you can read this. I don't think you can you? Oh, geez. Accommodation and food services. So we're starting to get into the kind of the hospitality kind of area. So it's 8,000, roughly 6% of the total. 11,000 in manufacturing. So, I mean, it's really interesting. We'll talk a little about manufacturing in a moment, but 8% of the total population, it's actually quite similar to the Victorian, the Victorian average. And I think that's not something that could be said about the Geelong region for some time. We've obviously well publicised the changes that are occurring in that sector. But, yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. 13,000 in education and training.
That's if it's not all online by then.
That's right. Who knows what Horizon will be in by then? But this is largely school, primary and secondary school.
Compulsory education.
The compulsory education. But you can see it's a significant portion. Okay, let's start. I've let it out. You can't read it anyway. Okay, what's next? Who can guess what's next? Construction. Oh, you can read it. Oh, oh, you guys already know all this stuff. So it's 11% of the total. 15,000 jobs in construction. 11% of the total. There will be a bit of growth in that, but not a great deal. But it is compared to a 9% sort of Victoria-wide. So there's a larger proportion here than elsewhere. A lot of that is driven through the Surf Coast Shire, from what I understand, and a lot of the new residential developments that are still kind of going up around there and around the outskirts of Geelong. Yeah, so you guys are the locals. I come from Ballarat, so fill me in. Okay, what's next? Health? That includes tertiary education. Yeah. Health and yeah. Any other? Retail. Retail. So similar to construction and similar to the rate in Victoria. I wonder how many more there are left. I can't quite remember myself, so this will all... Anyone got a guess what might come next? I think tourism might kind of be part of this accommodation and sort of food services. But it's an interesting way of looking at, like, we can start thinking about health and social assistance. By far the biggest employer. That may not come as a surprise, but it's quite interesting to see it laid out that way, how much bigger it is than almost any others in 5 years' time.
Is that where we fit? What's that figure?
No, you'd probably be... in social assistance, yes.
Or in education?
That's right, yeah. It probably depends how you feel. Depends how the ABS, this is not census stuff, it's kind of based on census, but it's based on sort of industry data. 17% of the total compared to 13% in Victoria. So you're stronger in that sense here than most other places in Victoria. And then, sorry everyone else, but the rest I've put in the middle there, 15,000. And you'll get some material that kind of, gives you a bit more detail around what the rest is. But I think that's a really, I hope, kind of useful picture. No, this is jobs. This is jobs. Part-time jobs and full-time jobs. And we can break that down a bit. I haven't done that for today, but
30,000 you said last time, is that right?
Approximately 130,000.
130,000 out of 330 would be captured here.
Yeah, not quite the 330, 300 or something, but it's the people aged 15 plus with a job.
Of the general population. So
yeah.
you're looking at a third of the whole population.
more or less, yeah. So these are the people with jobs, yes.
But does that include casual jobs?
Yeah, would do. Yep,
Of how many hours?
So is it-
So if they've got 5 hours a week, is that going to be in that picture?
I'd say so. Yeah. So that's one of the things you've got to grapple with a bit as well, yeah. Sorry?
I was just wondering where, with your own not considered unemployed by statistics, if you work for 1 hour a week, so is this the same, including those same?
Look, I'll have to go back and check. I can have a look at sort of the source. This comes from the Department of Employment, and they have said that it includes Federal Department of Employment.
Yeah, so
That-
they'll include everyone, yeah. You may only be working 5 hours a week and you'll be considered to have a job.
There you go. But I think that gives a good picture, and you're getting a good sense of where things... So now let's look a little bit about the growth. So if there's approximately 10,000 new jobs between now and then, new jobs is kind of one way of looking at it. More jobs or however, but these are the sort of the new jobs, because there's obviously some industries that are declining and so on, so it's not quite as simple to say it's just new jobs. But anyway, in this Geelong region, remember each one of these is 100 people. So if we look at 4,000 of these new jobs will be in that health and social services. So that's this group of people. That's about 40% of employment growth or job growth is coming in this health and social sector. 40% here, it's about 25% elsewhere in Australia and Victoria, or in average. So there is something going on here that is kind of leading that. Now, this is a bit of statistical. Anyway, I took this from another source, and I'm making a connection here. Of these 4,000 new jobs in health and social services, a bit over half of them will require like a diploma level education, which is quite high compared to most sectors.
Include childcare.
Yep, this includes childcare, yes. About a quarter requires certificate qualifications, and the rest don't. So we're talking about 20% employed in this in this kind of emerging part of the job market without formal qualifications. Now, there's maybe some statisticians here who are gasping at the leaps of logic that I'm kind of making here, but this is based on census data in the Barwon Southwest region. This analysis of kind of who requires the levels of education. So it's not, I've sort of matched two bits of data together to just give the sense. So if we're talking about 20%, that's about 800 people between now and 2020, starting their potentially employment pathways in the health and social services, and another 900 or so opportunities to move into certificate qualified roles. So I think that's just giving you just a sense of the kind of one of the markets that you're looking at.
Just a question, harking back to your previous slides.
Yep.
Where you've got all the aggregated or disaggregated data. That one.
Yep.
Who did the modelling? I'm just trying to get a bit of a handle on
The
the
Department of
projections.
Employment, the Federal Department of
And
Employment.
is that document available?
Yeah, I've got links to it at the end of this, and I've got some. I don't have the handouts on me, but yeah.
Was it based on projections? So
Yeah. Yes, projections. Yes, they do this every year. They update their projections. This is the 2016 projections released just a few weeks ago. So you're getting a bit of a sense there. I'm not going to go into this level of detail for all of them. I think this as a particularly sort of large portion. And what do we know about this change? Well, it's driven by population growth, as we kind of spoke about before, and the higher than average population growth that's occurring here, people need those services. So it drives those things like health, social services and education, as you saw a bit of growth there. But like I said, the ageing population with chronic disease, well, not everyone, but there's a higher tendency for chronic disease that will drive the demand. There's an increasing, obviously with the population growth, the increasing demand for childcare, and there is a growing need for, or demand for, home-based services. And I guess that's what I was talking about with when I was kind of outlining the baby boomer. The change that's happening through baby boomer generations is that when you think about things like aged care, there is the idea that you can go into an aged care facility and sort of live out years there is really being challenged by the generation that grew up in the 1960s. And so that's leading to new skills and new systems needing to be set up. So this idea of home-based care is going to be huge. I'm sure some of you are kind of seeing some of this, but that's going to be a big driver. The growth of the NDIS. Looks like I've copied this out of the maybe some publicity for the NDIS, but anyway, but there's a trend towards person-centred care, and again, this kind of often home-based care, but sort of will drive potentially a lot of perhaps smaller operators within the market, as well as the bigger operators. I'm sure some of you have observed what's happening in the NDIS here in Barwon. But there will be this is one of the things that's driving those kind of need for the lower skilled workers. Part-time roles, a big part of this growth, has kind of been pointed out. Strong demand for personal care is kind of along the lines of what I was talking about before. On top of this kind of new growth as well is that, a high proportion, about a third of this workforce is aged 50 plus, and that there will be, not in this necessarily in this time frame, but before too long, that there'll be I've got the figure here, up to 5,000 replacement workers probably required in the next 10 to 15 years as well.
We have to work till 70 now.
That's 77, isn't it?
So it's just that automatic drop-off, which happened in the past.
Yeah.
From sort of 50 on, people retiring
That's
not going to happen.
That's right, and that's the policy intention of that, I suppose. But it still means that as people age, people don't always get through it. There is a higher tendency for the career change.
I'm just wondering if that's one of those changes that
hasn't really come through yet, but even so, there will be a high replacement.
But one also wonders about like some of these care industries, whether and also other industries that have physical requirements, whether people are going to be able to. So whether you're going to see unemployment going up, and people needing to look at what they'd be going to do, but the sort of lifting and carrying in many of the care industries will be really difficult for people to do when they're 77.
Particularly the lower qualified kind of.
It will be for me anyway.
Like I said, I'm not going to go through that level for all of them, but new jobs in education and training, like I said, mostly in the school sector with population growth. And I think someone mentioned before about kindergarten and childcare. Childcare, I think, is in the social services, social assistance. But there will also be a growth in sort of the kindergarten and early childhood learning, with a lot of the frameworks and policies kind of coming through, requiring higher ratios, or lower ratios, I suppose, more staff, and at different qualification levels. So there will be opportunities through there. 800 new jobs in accommodation and food services, and about another 800 in retail make up kind of the bulk of that sort of analysis. The industries that are experiencing loss of jobs, so manufacturing, I think, is the most obvious one. The figures that we've got are saying like, a net loss of about 800 in that period. I think in reality it's bigger than that, in that while there will be jobs coming in to replace those jobs that are going in some of the large manufacturing firms here in Geelong and surrounds, they won't necessarily be the same people going into those jobs. So we're talking about a net job loss here. So there are other figures that are showing figures as high as 3,000 and more. But this is the Department of Employment. Again, I'm sure they've got their perspectives.
And those jobs will be higher skill
Yes,
in the future?
that's right. So the shifting into value-added manufacturing is kind of what's been talked about a lot. So the high end. I've got a quote here from the Skilling the Bay report, which is an amazing, very good resource. But like the skill requirements of new industries in clean technology and advanced manufacturing are not all that different from the so-called old skills in this sector. I just kind of put that in as I don't personally sort of understand the skill requirements of the manufacturing industry, but it just seemed like a bit of a counter view from what I had been hearing in there, and it'd be interesting if anyone else has sort of been involved in that sort of Skilling the Bay project to understand that. But notwithstanding that, I guess it's pointed there are possibilities for that sort of maybe slight reskilling to get into some of those other industries. But notwithstanding that, it is largely an older workforce, so kind of some of the similar issues in the health sector. But different to the health sector, there's a high proportion who have no qualifications. Still one of the, but given all this and the decline we saw on the picture before, it's still one of the largest employers in the region. So again, looking at the sort of horizon perspective, it's still, it's still something that, you know, if you're looking at skilling people for jobs now, it's still something that needs to very much be on your radar and kind of thinking about how that industry is shifting rather than moving completely away from it. It's dominated by sort of small and medium dominated is not the right word, but there are a lot of small and medium enterprises. This report from 2012 from Geelong region talks about 688 manufacturing companies in this region. I'd say that number would be a bit lower now, but I think there is a tendency to think of the big, the big employers, the Ford and Alcoa and so on, but there is also a lot of other there. So this is not quite as exciting a visual as I might have had before, but this is just kind of summarising all of those at once. So the projected change in employment by industry, I know you can't sort of read that. That was in the handout that I was planning to hand out, but anyway. You can see healthcare and social assistance kind of towering above the rest in terms of the projected change over this time. It kind of drops off quite rapidly, but we've got construction, education, retail, accommodation and food, so that kind of tourism, and then it's kind of pretty marginal, and then we get into the manufacturing, which, you know, in reality could well be sort of even more than that. So that just gives you that sort of broad overview. And then again, the sort of the qualification levels by industry of employment in the Barwon Southwest region, so it includes that Southwest as well, and it's from 2011, the last census. But I've kind of categorised here, this is largest to smallest kind of those without qualifications in this industry. So retail, trade, manufacturing, accommodation and food services and agriculture are still the top ones in terms of that sort of, possibly that sort of entry level, you know, if you're thinking about sort of entry level, you know, unqualified kind of labour market. Which just changes the picture a bit if you're just looking at these kind of, you know, absolute figures, which I thought would be kind of a useful perspective for you to have. Health and social services, obviously the biggest employment by far, but still a really important sort of lower qualification end of that labour force market. Again, part of the handout that I don't quite have on me at the moment. So yeah, I mean, what else do we know? Oh yes, what else do we know about G21? Well, we know that it includes Colac Otway as well. So again, apologies for those of you from Colac, those figures haven't been included there, but again, so this is just something to give a bit of a, just to kind of show how it's a little bit different. And again, haven't quite got the, I know you can't quite read this necessarily, but we're talking here healthcare and social assistance, again, the largest employer, but by not nearly as much of a margin as elsewhere. 1,100, this is from 2011 in the census, over 1,000 employees, 510 of them in hospital, so half of that, you know, dominated by the hospital service, as you'd expect. But then manufacturing and agriculture are sort of next, with about 2,000 between them. So, and about half of them are in the dairy-related industry.
Yes, so those jobs are gone then?
Those ones are...
Now?
Yeah.
What's happening to the dairy industry?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so there you go. So that's the kind of...
So that's a big...
You can see the dominant...
There is certainly in high offices.
Yes, that's right. It's kind of in that transition. Yep.
So we'll go right through all of the farms, so there'll be no dairy farms.
Yep. Yes, that's right. No, so that's a major part of the economy in Colac Otway. So I think I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, but like these are the figures. And then education and trade. And then the biggest single sectors in here, kind of schools, education and training, and public administration and safety, that, you know, there's local, Commonwealth and state kind of employment there. Yeah, so kind of as alluded to before, what else do we know about G21? That there are a lot of small to medium enterprises here in this region with a few large key employers. So this is something that I've borrowed from the Skilling the Bay labour market report. Again, you can't quite see, but it's kind of just showing the proportionate, you know, the major employers in the public sector, I suppose, with Barwon Health, as you would expect, with that sort of health and social assistance profile really dominating here, and then Department of Education with schools, and then the university, you know, the university, City of Greater Geelong, Gordon Institute and of TAFE, and the Transport Accident Commission, you know, real sort of dominant employers here. This is all the private sector, which is a bit harder to get data for. But that's a lot of those kind of small, medium enterprises that we're talking about in manufacturing. This is the least engaging slide of the whole thing, but it's actually where I could find, like, this is again from the Skilling the Bay report, and you can get copies of it where it actually does go through sort of some of the major employers and their kind of relative, you know, numbers of full-time equivalent employees. Back to 2012, so things will have changed a bit since then, but I'll leave that with you as well. But again, Barwon Health really right up the top, and a number of other organisations there. What else do we know about the region? This is from the employer survey from 2015 that went around. Competition for jobs is really high. On average, 11 people apply for each vacancy, and an average of 2 are invited for interview. So why don't people get interviews? Well, the feedback that comes through this survey is that there's a lack of those soft skills. So it's not necessarily the vocational skills, but it's the, you know, the communication and presentation kind of skills, and poor applications being submitted. Also, there is a lack of qualification and lack of experience. Even with this high competition, we've been being told by the employers that there's one third of employers who are having difficulty recruiting into their roles, and the reasons given, employability skills, particularly in the kind of the lower qualification jobs with lower qualification requirements. They're talking about employability skills, and what does that mean? Interpersonal and social skills, customer service, communication, teamwork. This is the stuff that's kind of coming back from the surveys and from some of the stuff that the department's done. And then they're talking about sort of personal characteristics, which is, I guess, a bit harder to characterise, but enthusiasm and motivation, presentation and confidence, reliability and work ethic. And I guess to just put that up here, just as a kind of bit of a reminder to that sort of frame that I kind of put around before, around the 21st century skills that the World Economic Forum are talking about in the context of all those changes that we're talking about before. And you can see a lot of match over here between sort of the foundational literacies and the employability skills that are being spoken about, the competencies and the character qualities. I think I just kind of get across that you got, and this matches with a lot of the expertise that you guys will have in your communities. What else do we know? There's industrial decline and kind of transition to new economies is kind of something that's spoken about a lot in this region, and that's happened elsewhere in the world. The Skilling the Bay, again, the final report had a sort of set of comparisons with international examples in Ireland and Canada and Wales. And really to summarise what they were saying, they were really looking at these multi-stakeholder approaches. So not just within the sectors that you're looking at, but outside of the sectors. It's more than just kind of training opportunities or training or qualifications for qualification's sake. They're saying that's the kind of stuff that isn't really working necessarily in these areas, but it's about linking between the supply of labour, I suppose, to the demand into those industries. So strong understanding of that is needed, and kind of working with the employers to know what they need, understand what they need, and then design particularly for that through targeted and focused projects. So regional programs that are well planned and implemented, I suppose, is kind of, they're saying is the way to go. So the examples they use, apprenticeship schemes, programs that are developing the training system and focusing them in on local needs. Again, this employer-driven approach to education rather than leaving them out of the loop. And this kind of idea of small businesses being allowed to pool resources, similar concept to what you guys are talking about here, but in terms of coming together and collaborating, but that having small business, particularly here, I suppose, with the large, small to medium enterprise profile that you've got, the forums for them to kind of come together. And yeah, and this is like a model that I've kind of put together that I thought might, yeah, but basically, yeah, I won't go into that. I think I've maybe gone a little bit over time and not left much time for questions, but I know that the ACFI Regional Council in Barwon South West have got a couple of projects available that are looking to address kind of some of these sort of partnership issues, you know, looking for stronger partnerships within some of these different sectors here, different parts of like what we're describing as this kind of ecosystem, employment ecosystem. A couple of opportunities to get involved in a couple of projects that kind of address some of these issues locally across the region. So I think get in touch with Georgina if you're interested in taking part in some of those. That really does address a lot of the stuff that we're kind of looking at today and giving you opportunities to develop. I'm sure there are other programs out there as well that you might talk about today as well. So thank you. I hope I got that balance, like I was saying, between the litany of information that is available out there, represented here by a few kind of links that I'd encourage you to have a look at if you're into this kind of thing. But I hope you've got a better idea of sort of what the next 5 years or so might look like in terms of employment.